Welcome to lesson 19. We're going to look at batches. We're going to see how you can create a new multi-threaded batch process. The example that we're going to take is, I'm going to look at the batch control within the application, and we're going to take one which processes and looks at the user setup processes and checks to see those records that are in a state longer than a certain amount of time, longer than the number of days, a specific number of days. And if it has been in that state for longer than that number of days, then it will create a to-do. In our case, we're going to actually set that using a status condition, and we're going to set a status condition on the pending state, and we're going to look for that status condition, and if more than 1 day or whatever days has passed, we will create a to-do. You will see that we are running this as a multi-threaded batch control, and let me just show you the run tree where I'm in the middle of processing those threads. So we have one which is in progress over here, and we have split up this batch control, this batch, into 6 threads, and we're processing each thread separately, and we've processed the first 3 threads, and what it has done, it has produced different, each thread has produced different to-dos, and the to-dos are like this, saying that a particular process has been waiting in a certain status for longer than 1 day, and it basically sending an alert. So we see that a concept of a batch can be run in separate threads, and generally what we see is that a batch job, if it is able to run multi-threaded, separates the workload into multiple number of threads, and each thread is then responsible to perform certain work units. So let us go to the code to see how that works. We're going to look at this particular code, which is found in the package config tools, too-long batch process. If we have a look at it, we will see that it has an annotation batch job, and it has the soft parameters matching the batch control with a number of days and the maximum number of errors. Now, the best thing to do when you're working with a batch is look at lots of examples. The code is a little trickier than a standard implementation code that we've seen previously, but by looking at other examples, you see how it works. If you have a look at the class, it extends a generated class that will be created when you run the artifact generator, but it relies upon an inner worker class, and the inner worker class has the same name with worker, and that's the main inner class that we're going to be looking at. And most probably the most important thing is there's something called the thread execution strategy. It basically tells you how are we going to be dealing with the threading, and we're using something called a thread iteration strategy, and that is the one that we'll be using in this example. There are a few different strategies, and if you look at the help, you will see the Java docs, you will see that there's questions of how do you run everything in a single transaction or multiple transactions. And thread iteration strategy that we have here relies upon a query, a JDBC query, to actually get the workload and separate it out into different work units. There are other actual strategies as well that you can look at. There's single transaction strategy. There is thread execution strategy, and so on. So, iteration strategy, commit every unit strategy, and so on. So one should look at different examples and see how this works. This one is a classic example of working with a query, and you'll see how that works. Let's progress slowly down, and you'll see how it starts with a of create the execution strategies we saw, and then initiate the thread work, actually what work needs to be done. And in the initiate thread work method here, we are actually just validating many of the different inputs that we have, the number of days, the soft parameters. We're going to be creating a to-do, and the to-do is actually found on the do type is related to the batch control through the creation process over here. So we're doing some testing for that as well. Those details I'm not really going to look into, but the most important thing is now is that the initiate starts a query, and that is the beginning of getting the data that you need for the work units. So the start result row query iterator for thread is over here, and what it does is it calls a query, and this is the main work that we need to look at, and this is an SQL using Hibernate to query the user setup processes of a specific option type. We're looking at status condition equal to staying too long, and if it's longer than a certain amount of days, then we get back a query result. And that query result gives you back something called an iterator, which is the input into getting the next work unit. So the get next work unit takes the result row from above, and what the get next unit needs to do is take each unit and get the ID and pass that into the execute work unit. The execute work unit then works on each unit at a time and does whatever work it needs to do. And in this case, it's going to complete old to-dos and then create new, if for example we've run this batch previously, and then we're going to create new to-dos. Again, the most important thing is to actually look at other examples and see how this works. Once you've actually completed your batch, in order to run it, you can actually run it directly from the Eclipse by running the submit job, which is equivalent of running this online, doing an online submit. Just to point out, there's something called the thread pool worker. The thread pool worker it needs to be run in order to process your jobs, whether you're processing it online or processing it through the submit job. You need to actually have that running. So that is all basically I want to show you. I'm not going to go into the detail of how we can create new to-dos. That is code that we've seen previously. Again, the most important thing is to see one example, or a few different examples of the execution strategy. In this case, taking one from an SQL statement. And again, the highlight of this that I wanted to show you was the initialize the thread work, calls the start result row query iterator. The iterator is responsible of getting a query back and getting a query iterator, and then passing that information onto the get next work unit to create individual work units, and then you execute the work units one by one. So that in the end, this code, the one last thing I wanted to show you is that because this is running multi-threaded, then as an input into this particular program will be the inputs low and high ID, which are very important because those are the separated, depending upon the number of units that you are, how many threads you are running, you will get a low and high ID with different bands. So for example, in our case where we saw that we're running 6 threads, then the inputs into this program over here, when I'm running thread count 6 and thread number 3, we'll get a chunk of that the work, and the chunk of the work will come into here by giving us a low and high ID, and we are separating our data into the query by the low and high and doing a query filtering the data of the ID by that low and high, so that for each particular thread that is run, we're going to get a different band, and it will deal with the data separately. So hopefully you have an idea of how in a high level, the batch separates the work into separate thread work, and the code which runs will, in our case, when it's running through an iterator, take a query and query the data and then separate them into distinct work units and then process.